The woman had been driving home after a long day, her mind preoccupied with the responsibilities waiting for her the next morning. As the night deepened, she turned onto a quiet road, the city lights fading into the background. Suddenly, flashing lights reflected in her rearview mirror, and her stomach churned. It was a police car signaling for her to pull over. Confusion swept over her. She hadn't broken any laws, hadn't been speeding. But she knew that none of that mattered. As she slowly pulled over to the side of the road, the car behind her came to a stop, its lights still flashing. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the unease rising within her. She had been in situations like this before, but they never got easier. Despite the years of progress she had made in her career and her unwavering professionalism, moments like these reminded her of the invisible barrier that still surrounded her because of the color of her skin. Two police officers emerged from the car, both white, their postures rigid and authoritative. She noticed the way they exchanged glances as they approached her window. One officer knocked on the window with more force than necessary, causing her to jump slightly. She rolled it down, her hands placed visibly on the steering wheel. "License and registration," the officer demanded in a cold tone. His eyes scanned her face with suspicion, as though he was searching for something, anything, that could justify his actions. She nodded, reaching into her bag for her wallet and retrieving the documents. The officer grabbed them from her hand without a word of thanks, stepping back to examine them. The second officer, a younger man, hovered nearby, his eyes flickering with a hint of uncertainty as he glanced at his partner. The first officer looked up from her documents, his expression hardening. "You were driving suspiciously," he said, his tone accusatory. "Where are you headed?" The woman furrowed her brow. "I'm just going home," she answered evenly, refusing to let her voice shake. There was nothing suspicious about her actions, and she knew it. But the way the officer looked at her, as though she didn't belong in that car on that road at that time of night, sent a chill down her spine. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered abruptly, motioning for her to exit. She hesitated for a moment, but complied, knowing that resisting could only make things worse. As she stepped out of the car, the officer moved closer, his demeanor growing more hostile. "Mind if we take a look inside your vehicle?" he asked, though it was clear that it wasn't a question but a command. She stood there silently, her heart pounding. She didn't have anything to hide, but she knew the drill. This wasn't about suspicion. It was about control. The officer started searching through her car, pulling open compartments and rifling through her belongings without care. The younger officer stood by, looking increasingly uncomfortable, but saying nothing. She watched as the first officer continued his invasive search, feeling her frustration mounting. There was nothing suspicious in her car, and she knew they wouldn't find anything. But the fact that she had to go through this at all made her blood boil. She wanted to reveal her identity right then, to tell them exactly who she was, to make them understand the gravity of their actions. But something held her back. She wanted to see just how far they would take this injustice, how deep their prejudices ran before she showed them the truth. As the woman stood by the side of the road, watching the first officer rummage through her car, a knot of frustration began to tighten in her chest. She had done nothing wrong, but here she was, being treated like a criminal. The younger officer continued to stand back, his arms crossed, his gaze shifting between his partner and her, but he made no move to stop the invasive search. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first officer stepped away from her car. He hadn't found anything suspicious, but his expression hadn't softened. He was still looking at her with that same air of suspicion and hostility. "Why were you driving this way?" he asked again, his tone sharp. "You seem nervous. Is there something you're not telling us?" The woman clenched her jaw, biting back the retort that rose to her lips. "I'm not nervous," she said calmly. "I've told you, I'm just going home." The officer narrowed his eyes, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. "We're going to need to run a background check," he said, turning to his partner. "Radio it in." The younger officer hesitated for a split second before nodding and walking back to the patrol car to make the call. The woman remained where she was, her heart pounding. This was beyond humiliating, but she knew she had to keep her composure. Reacting with anger would only escalate the situation. As the minutes dragged on, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had been stopped by the police before, but this felt different, more personal, more targeted. They weren't just treating her like a suspect. They were treating her like she didn't belong. The younger officer returned, his face pale, holding the radio in his hand. The woman noticed the shift in his expression immediately, the way his eyes darted from her to his partner. Something had changed. We got the results, the younger officer said quietly, his voice barely audible. He was clearly uncomfortable, and the woman knew why. Her background check had come back with a name they hadn't expected. The first officer frowned, clearly irritated by his partner's hesitation. "What is it?" he snapped. The younger officer swallowed hard. She's Judge Warren. A federal judge," he stammered, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke the words. For a moment, there was complete silence. The first officer's face drained of color as the realization hit him. The woman watched as his entire demeanor shifted, from arrogance and superiority to shock and fear. She could almost see the gears turning in his mind, the dawning understanding of the mistake he had made. Judge Warren. The name carried weight, authority, and respect. It was a name that commanded attention in the highest courts of law. And yet, here she was, standing by the side of the road, being treated like a common criminal. The woman didn't say anything, letting the silence speak for itself. The first officer's mouth opened and closed a few times as he struggled to find words. He knew he had crossed a line, several lines in fact, and now there was no going back. "Ma'am, Judge Warren, I didn't realize," he began, his voice faltering. She met his gaze steadily, her face impassive. "No, you didn't," she said quietly, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of her authority. The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner for support, but the younger man seemed equally shaken. Neither of them had expected this, and now they were scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation. The woman waited, watching them both, her silence more powerful than any words she could have spoken. They had humiliated her, treated her like she was less than human, and now they were faced with the reality of who she was. The silence hung heavy in the air as the two officers stood there, stunned by the revelation. The woman, Judge Warren, remained calm, her eyes locked on the first officer, who was still fumbling for words. His bravado had crumbled, and now he was left grappling with the consequences of his actions. The younger officer shifted uneasily, clearly out of his depth, and unsure of what to do next. I'm sorry, Your Honor," the first officer finally stammered, his voice filled with hesitation. "We didn't know." The woman raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask." "You assumed," she replied evenly, her voice sharp but controlled. "You assumed that because I'm a black woman, driving on a quiet road at night, I must be up to something suspicious." The officer opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He knew she was right. His silence only confirmed it. Judge Warren stepped closer, her presence commanding. "Do you treat everyone this way? Or just people who look like me?" she asked pointedly, her eyes narrowing. The officer flinched at the accusation, but he didn't respond. The truth was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The younger officer finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was just a routine stop. We didn't mean." "You didn't mean to what?" Judge Warren interrupted, her gaze shifting to him. "To humiliate me? To treat me like a criminal when all I was doing was driving home?" The younger officer swallowed hard, his face pale. "We were just following protocol," he muttered weakly. But even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. "Protocol," she repeated, the word dripping with sarcasm. "Is it protocol to tear apart someone's car without any probable cause? Is it protocol to treat someone with disrespect just because they don't fit your idea of what's normal?" The officers stood in silence, their shame evident in their expressions. They had no defense, no excuse that could justify their actions. They had overstepped their authority, and now they were being called out for it by someone who held far more power than they ever could have imagined. Judge Warren took a deep breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had dealt with prejudice and discrimination her whole life, but that didn't make moments like this any easier. She was tired of being treated as if she were less than, simply because of the color of her skin. But she also knew that she couldn't let this slide. Not this time. You should know better, she said, her voice steady but firm. You should both know better. You're supposed to protect and serve, not profile and harass. The first officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the ground. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again, he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. Judge Warren wasn't satisfied. I'll be filing a formal complaint with your department, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been treated unfairly by people like you. The younger officer's face drained of color, and the first officer's shoulders slumped in defeat. They both knew the severity of the situation they had created, and now there was no escaping the consequences. As the tension in the air thickened, the sound of another car approaching broke the silence. It was a patrol car, and inside was the officer's superior, a stern-looking man with a sharp gaze. He stepped out of the car, immediately sensing the tension in the scene before him. "What's going on here?" the superior demanded, his eyes moving between the officers and Judge Warren. The first officer began to speak, but Judge Warren cut him off. "I'd like to speak with you," she said directly to the superior. "These officers have overstepped their bounds." The superior's expression tightened, and he gestured for the officers to step back. "I'm sorry for any misunderstanding, ma'am," he said quickly. "We'll address this immediately." Judge Warren nodded, but her gaze remained cold. "You'd better, because this isn't over." As Judge Warren watched the two officers shrink back, their faces pale and filled with regret, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. Despite her position of power, she was still treated as inferior, still judged based on her appearance. It was a reminder that no matter how far she had come, the world still saw her through the lens of her skin color. She had fought hard to be where she was, but moments like this made it clear that the fight was far from over. The officer's superior, now standing between them and Judge Warren, tried to defuse the situation, but there was no easy way out of this. His calm demeanor didn't change the fact that they had made a critical error. Judge Warren wasn't just an ordinary citizen. She was someone with influence, someone who knew the law better than any of them. And she wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. "We sincerely apologize, ma'am," the superior said, his voice steady. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Judge Warren crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "A misunderstanding? No. This was a failure of judgment. You don't get to treat people this way and then brush it off as a misunderstanding." The superior nodded, clearly aware that the usual excuses wouldn't work here. "You're right, Your Honor. This was unacceptable. I assure you we will address it." She sighed, her frustration evident. "This isn't about apologies. It's about accountability. People like me are stopped, questioned, and humiliated on the side of the road far too often, and you, as officers of the law, should be the first to understand the impact of your actions." The superior's expression tightened, but he remained composed. "We'll launch an investigation. I'll personally see to it." Judge Warren's eyes softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. She had heard promises like this before, too many times, but this time, she had the power to ensure that something would actually be done. "Good," she said finally, her voice calmer but still sharp. "Because this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has been treated this way." The younger officer, who had been standing quietly off to the side, now spoke up, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," he said, his face full of remorse. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Judge Warren looked at him for a moment, considering his words. He seemed genuinely regretful, but that didn't change the fact that he had been part of the problem. "Intentions aren't enough," she replied softly. "What matters are your actions, and today, your actions were harmful." The officer lowered his gaze, his face flushed with embarrassment. It was clear that he hadn't expected this outcome, but it was a lesson he needed to learn. The tension hung in the air for a few moments longer, the weight of the situation sinking in for everyone involved. Judge Warren had made her point. The officers had been put in their place, and their superior had promised to take action. But as she stood there, watching them, she knew that the real challenge was yet to come. Would they truly learn from this? Or would this be just another incident, forgotten in a few days? "I'll be following up," Judge Warren said finally, her voice cutting through the silence. "Don't think for a second that I won't." The superior nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "We appreciate your patience, Your Honor. We'll ensure this is handled properly." Without another word, Judge Warren turned and walked back to her car. She could feel the eyes of the officers on her as she opened the door, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The message had been sent loud and clear. As she drove away, the adrenaline slowly began to fade, replaced by a deep sense of exhaustion. It wasn't the first time she had been treated unfairly, and sadly, it probably wouldn't be the last. But today, she had used her position to stand up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly. And that, she knew, was a victory, even if the fight wasn't over yet. As Judge Warren drove away from the tense scene, her mind raced with thoughts. The reality of what had just happened weighed heavily on her. It wasn't just the humiliation. She was used to that, even though she shouldn't have to be. But the sheer disregard for her dignity as a human being. The officers had acted with such certainty, such arrogance, without even the slightest hesitation. To them, she had been just another black woman who didn't belong, another person to control and put in her place. But this time, they had picked the wrong target. The streets blurred as she drove, her grip tight on the steering wheel. She replayed the encounter in her mind, every detail vivid. The flashing lights in her rearview mirror, the aggressive tone in the officer's voice, the way they had rifled through her belongings as if she were a criminal. She had been silent at first, trying to process their audacity, but as the situation escalated, she realized that silence wouldn't protect her. It never did. She had been calm, measured, and yet the fury simmered beneath her exterior. It wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had ever been stopped for looking suspicious, for daring to exist in spaces where they were not expected. Her position as a judge might have protected her from further harm, but what about those who didn't have that privilege? The thought gnawed at her. Arriving at her home, she parked the car and sat for a moment, her hands still gripping the wheel. Her reflection stared back at her from the rearview mirror, tired but resolute. She had fought her way through law school, through every barrier that had been placed in front of her as a woman and as a person of color. She had earned her place on the bench, not through favors or shortcuts, but through sheer determination and talent. And yet, in the eyes of those officers, none of that had mattered. As she stepped out of the car and into the cool night air, she made a decision. She would not let this pass quietly. The officer's superior had promised an investigation. But she knew how these things worked. Investigations could be slow, bureaucratic, easily swept under the rug if no one pushed hard enough. But she had the power to make sure this one wasn't forgotten. Her voice would not be silenced. She pulled out her phone and quickly drafted an email to her colleague, an attorney who specialized in civil rights cases. This wasn't just about holding those two officers accountable. It was about challenging a system that allowed this kind of behavior to persist. She would use every tool at her disposal to ensure that change came, not just for herself, but for those who faced this type of discrimination daily. As she hit send, her resolve solidified. This would not be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of something bigger, something that might finally shake the foundations of a system designed to control rather than protect. The night was quiet, but her mind buzzed with plans and possibilities. She wouldn't just be a judge tomorrow. She would be a warrior, fighting not in the courtroom, but in the streets, in the halls of power, wherever her voice could reach. For now, though, she needed rest. She stepped into her house, locking the door behind her. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The next morning, Judge Warren awoke with a sense of purpose. The events of the previous day still lingered. But today, she had a plan. She dressed quickly, her mind already running through the steps she needed to take. This wasn't going to be just a personal fight. It was about systemic change, and she was ready to confront it head-on. As she sat down with her morning coffee, her phone buzzed with messages of support. Word had already begun to spread among her colleagues and friends about what had happened. Her attorney friend, whom she had reached out to the night before, had responded with enthusiasm. He was more than willing to take on the case, to help push for an investigation that wouldn't just stop at apologies and reprimands. They were going to make this matter. But first, there was another call she needed to make. With a deep breath, she dialed the police department, requesting to speak with the superior officer who had been at the scene. There was no room for hesitation now. The officer quickly answered, his tone polite but guarded, clearly aware that this situation had escalated beyond a simple roadside incident. "Good morning, Judge Warren," he greeted, his voice steady but tense. "I trust everything is well?" "Not quite," she replied, her voice cool but firm. "I wanted to follow up on yesterday's incident. I understand you promised an internal investigation, but I want to be very clear. I expect full transparency. This is not going to disappear quietly." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and she could hear the officer's discomfort. "Of course, Your Honor. We take these matters seriously, and I assure you, we're already reviewing the body cam footage and protocols." "Good," Judge Warren said, her tone unyielding, "because I've already contacted legal representation. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." The officer cleared his throat, clearly taken aback by her decisiveness. "We'll cooperate fully, Your Honor. I'm sure we can resolve this in a way that satisfies all parties involved." "That remains to be seen," she said curtly. "I'll be expecting updates on the investigation." As she hung up the phone, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just going to be an internal matter. It was going to be a public one. She wasn't afraid of exposing what had happened, of shining a light on the routine injustices that people like her faced every day. The officers who had stopped her needed to be held accountable, not just for their actions, but for the culture that allowed those actions to seem acceptable. The next few hours were spent drafting statements, coordinating with her attorney, and preparing for the inevitable media attention that would come once the story broke. She knew that making this public would bring scrutiny, both on her and on the police department, but it was a risk she was willing to take. Too many people had been silenced, their experiences brushed aside as isolated incidents. She was going to make sure this one wasn't. By midday, her phone was buzzing again, this time with reporters requesting interviews. Word had gotten out faster than she expected. News outlets were eager for a statement, a chance to expose yet another instance of racial profiling and abuse of power. Judge Warren wasn't eager to be in the spotlight, but she knew that her voice would carry weight, that her position would make people listen. As she prepared to speak publicly for the first time about the incident, she knew that this was only the beginning. The battle ahead was going to be long. And it wouldn't be easy. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, adjusting her blazer. The woman who stared back at her wasn't just a judge. She was a fighter, ready to stand up for herself and for everyone else who had been wronged. With one final deep breath, she stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. As the story began to gain traction in the media, Judge Warren found herself at the center of a whirlwind. Her phone was constantly buzzing with calls and messages from journalists, colleagues, and civil rights activists. The narrative of a respected black judge being humiliated by police officers had captured the public's attention. It was no longer just her story. It had become a symbol of a much larger issue. Despite the noise around her, Judge Warren remained focused. She knew that the media frenzy would die down eventually, but the real fight was just beginning. It wasn't about a few news cycles. It was about creating lasting change. She had been preparing for a day like this her whole life, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. Every struggle, every moment of doubt had led her to this point. Her attorney had already filed the necessary paperwork to launch a formal investigation into the conduct of the officers involved. But Judge Warren knew that legal action alone wasn't enough. She needed to keep the pressure on to make sure this didn't fade into the background like so many other cases. She reached out to her network, contacting civil rights organizations and influential figures who could help amplify the story. She wasn't going to let this die in silence. One evening, as she reviewed her notes for an upcoming press conference, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she answered it anyway, her voice calm but curious. "Judge Warren?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost nervous. "Yes, this is she," she replied. "My name is Officer Daniels. I'm the partner of Officer Gray, the one who stopped you the other day. I just wanted to talk." Judge Warren's breath caught in her throat. This was unexpected. Go on, she said cautiously. I wanted to apologize for how things went down that day, Daniels said, his voice faltering. It wasn't right, and I know that. I've been on the force for a long time, and I've never seen anything quite like it. I should have stepped in, but I didn't. I didn't know who you were, and that shouldn't have mattered. I'm sorry. The sincerity in his voice gave her pause. She had expected defensiveness, excuses, but not this. For a moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. I appreciate your apology, Officer Daniels, she said carefully. But you should know this isn't just about me. This is about a culture of policing that allows officers to act with impunity, especially towards people of color. What happened to me is just one example of a much bigger problem. I know, Daniels replied, his voice heavy with regret. I've seen it happen before. I'm not proud of it. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but I'm not calling to defend myself. I just wanted you to know that not everyone on the force agrees with what happened. Judge Warren's grip tightened on the phone. Then maybe it's time you did something about it. There was a long pause on the other end. Maybe you're right, Daniels finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. After the call ended, Judge Warren sat in silence for a few moments, processing what had just happened. It was a small step, but perhaps it was a sign that things were beginning to shift. Maybe, just maybe, there were cracks forming in the system. But she wasn't about to let her guard down. One officer's apology didn't erase the pain of what had happened or the reality of what countless others faced every day. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in days, she allowed herself a moment of hope. She wasn't alone in this. Change was possible, even if it came slowly, even if it came in small, unexpected moments. With renewed determination, she picked up her notes and prepared for the press conference. This story wasn't finished yet. The press conference was a turning point, and Judge Warren knew it had to be handled perfectly. As she stood behind the podium, facing a room filled with cameras, reporters, and flashing lights, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't just about her personal experience anymore. This was a platform to expose the deeper issues plaguing the system. Her goal was to ensure that what happened to her would spark meaningful conversations and real change. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. Her voice was steady, clear, and controlled, even as the anger and frustration from that day still lingered beneath the surface. Good afternoon, she started, looking directly into the cameras, knowing her words would be broadcast to thousands, if not millions. As many of you have heard by now, I was stopped during a routine traffic stop. I was asked to step out of my car and was questioned, not because I had broken the law, but because I was deemed suspicious due to the color of my skin. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. But what makes this case different isn't my profession. It's the fact that, as a Black woman, this type of treatment is something that far too many people in our community face on a daily basis. The difference is that, unlike so many others, I had the privilege of being able to fight back. But this shouldn't be about who you are or what title you hold. Every person, regardless of their position in society, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. A murmur spread through the room as reporters quickly scribbled down notes, their eyes wide with anticipation. Judge Warren could feel the weight of their focus, but she wasn't done yet. There was more to say, more to reveal. I'm here today not just as a victim, but as an advocate for change. I'm calling for a full, independent investigation into the practices of this police department and the systemic biases that allow these kinds of injustices to occur. This isn't just about one incident. It's about creating a safer, fairer environment for all. The room erupted with questions, hands shooting into the air, but she held up her hand, signaling that she wasn't finished. I've already spoken with legal counsel and civil rights organizations. We will be moving forward with legal action, not just for myself, but for the countless others who don't have the platform that I do. Her words were met with a mix of shock and admiration. This wasn't just a judge speaking about a personal experience. This was a woman using her position to launch a much-needed fight for justice. And the crowd could feel it. After finishing her prepared statement, she opened the floor to questions. A reporter stood up, microphone in hand. Judge Warren, have the officers involved reached out to you personally since the incident? Her jaw clenched slightly, but she kept her voice steady. One officer has. He expressed regret for what happened and acknowledged that the situation was handled poorly. However, I want to make it clear that one apology doesn't change the systemic issues at play. This isn't about one officer or one bad day. It's about a pattern of behavior that has been allowed to go unchecked for far too long. Another reporter jumped in. Do you think the officers would have treated you differently if they had known you were a judge from the start? Judge Warren met his gaze, her expression unwavering. That's exactly the problem. My profession should never have mattered. The fact that they would treat someone differently based on their title shows just how deeply these biases run. No one should have to prove their worth to be treated with dignity. The room fell silent for a moment as her words hit home. The press conference had shifted from being just a recounting of events to a powerful call for action. Everyone in the room could feel the urgency in her voice, the demand for something bigger than just apologies or investigations. As she wrapped up the session, she left the podium with a sense of accomplishment. But she knew this was only the beginning. The media would spread the word, but the real work lay ahead. She would continue pushing for reform, speaking out, and ensuring that this moment wasn't forgotten. Leaving the building, her phone buzzed with a flood of messages, but one stood out. It was from a prominent civil rights leader, offering support and asking to collaborate on efforts to reform police practices. Judge Warren smiled slightly as she read the message. This fight was growing beyond just her, and she was ready for it. As Judge Warren stepped out of the press conference, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. Her words had stirred up conversations far beyond the room, spreading across social media and news outlets like wildfire. The public was now aware of the incident, and more importantly, they were rallying behind her call for justice. But she knew that attention could be fleeting. People could move on to the next big story if the momentum wasn't maintained. She had to act quickly. That evening, Judge Warren met with her legal team and civil rights activists to strategize their next steps. They discussed not only the legal action against the officers, but also how to use this moment to highlight broader issues of systemic racism in law enforcement. The group was passionate, full of ideas, and determined to make this case a catalyst for change. However, amidst the planning, another layer of the story emerged. One of the activists, a seasoned civil rights attorney named Marcus, had been quietly digging into the backgrounds of the officers involved in her case. He had connections within the police department and had uncovered some disturbing information. "I've found something you need to know," Marcus said, his tone serious, as he slid a file across the table. Judge Warren opened it, her eyes scanning the documents inside. What she saw made her stomach turn. Officer Gray, the lead officer from the traffic stop, had a troubling history. He had been involved in multiple incidents of misconduct, including racial profiling, but each time the complaints had been quietly dismissed or covered up by the department. In one particularly disturbing case, a black man had filed a formal complaint against Officer Gray for excessive force, but the case had never seen the light of day. It had been swept under the rug with no consequences for the officer. "This isn't just about you," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "Officer Gray has been doing this for years. He's gotten away with it every time. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again." Judge Warren felt a wave of anger and frustration rise within her. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern. A pattern of abuse and injustice that had been allowed to continue unchecked. Her mind raced as she considered the implications of this new information. This wasn't just about holding the officers accountable for what happened to her. It was about exposing a deeply flawed system that protected bad cops at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve. "We have to get this out there," she said, her voice steely with determination. "People need to know the truth. This can't be buried." The group agreed. They began drafting a plan to not only pursue legal action against the officers, but also to launch a public campaign to demand accountability and transparency within the police department. They would call for a full investigation into Officer Gray's past as well as the department's handling of complaints against him. But as they worked late into the night, there was an underlying tension in the room. Judge Warren knew that going after Officer Gray and the department so publicly would make her a target. She was prepared for the backlash, but she also understood the risks involved. The police had immense power, and there were no guarantees that they would back down without a fight. The next day, the new revelations about Officer Gray's past were released to the press. The story exploded, adding fuel to an already raging fire. Public outcry grew louder, with calls for the officers to be suspended and for a broader investigation into the department. But with the increased attention came the inevitable pushback. That afternoon, as Judge Warren sat in her office, her phone buzzed with a call. It was a blocked number. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her instincts telling her something was off. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cold and unfamiliar. "You're making a lot of noise, Judge Warren. Be careful. Not everyone wants to see things change." The line went dead before she could respond. Her heart pounded in her chest as she set the phone down, her mind racing. It was a warning, clear and unmistakable. She was being watched, and the stakes were higher than ever. But instead of fear, the call only fueled her resolve. She had come too far to back down now. The truth was out, and the system that had protected Officer Gray for so long was finally being exposed. They could try to intimidate her, but she wasn't going to stop. Not until justice was served. The warning call weighed heavily on Judge Warren's mind, but she refused to be intimidated. She knew that pushing for justice would come with risks, but she also knew that backing down wasn't an option. The case had gained too much momentum, and the public was watching closely. Her next move had to be calculated but bold. As the legal and public campaign intensified, Judge Warren received a call from a key ally, Senator Collins, a longtime advocate for police reform. The senator had been following her story closely and wanted to meet with her. "This isn't just about one police department," Senator Collins said. "This is about reforming the system. We need to take this fight to a national level." The prospect of working with the senator was exciting. Together, they could push for broader police accountability reforms and potentially influence legislation that would have a long-lasting impact. Judge Warren agreed to meet with the senator in Washington, D.C., knowing that this could take her cause to new heights. Before she left for D.C., she decided to take a day to gather herself. The stress of the last few weeks had been overwhelming, and she needed time to process everything. But even during this brief moment of calm, the tension was never far away. As she sat in a quiet cafe, reviewing documents, a familiar figure caught her eye. It was Officer Gray, sitting at a table across the street, watching her. A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't a coincidence. He was sending her a message, reminding her that he was still there, that he hadn't been forgotten. Their eyes met briefly before he stood and walked away, leaving Judge Warren with a sense of unease that lingered long after he disappeared from view. Determined not to let him rattle her, she focused on preparing for the meeting with Senator Collins. The next day, she flew to Washington, feeling both anxious and hopeful. When she arrived at the senator's office, she was greeted warmly by his staff and led into a private conference room where Senator Collins was waiting. They discussed the case in depth, with the senator expressing admiration for how Judge Warren had handled herself in the face of adversity. "You've become a symbol for so many people who have been affected by racial injustice," Senator Collins said. "We need to use this moment to push for real, lasting change." Together, they began drafting a proposal for a comprehensive police reform bill. The bill would focus on increasing accountability, including mandatory body cameras, independent investigations of misconduct, and a national database to track officers with a history of abuse. It was ambitious, but both Judge Warren and Senator Collins knew that if they could get enough support, it could change the landscape of policing in the country. But as they worked, another obstacle arose. A major police union caught wind of the bill and launched a full-scale campaign against it, accusing Judge Warren and the senator of trying to dismantle law enforcement. The media began to spin the narrative, with some outlets painting Judge Warren as a radical out to destroy the police force. The backlash was swift and intense. Online threats flooded her social media accounts, and protesters began to show up at her public appearances, some chanting, "Support the police," while others held signs of support for her cause. The tension in the air was palpable. That night, after returning to her hotel room in Washington, Judge Warren received another ominous call. This time, the voice on the other end was more direct. "You've gone too far, Judge. Drop the case, or you'll regret it." Her hands shook as she hung up the phone. The threats were escalating, and it was clear that powerful forces were working against her. But just as she was starting to feel the weight of it all, her phone buzzed with another message. This one from a civil rights group that had been following her journey closely. They offered their full support, along with resources to help protect her and her family. As she stared at the message, she realized something important. She wasn't alone in this fight. People were rallying behind her, ready to stand with her, no matter the cost. She had allies in high places and on the ground, all committed to pushing forward, despite the dangers. Judge Warren knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. The threats might continue, the opposition might grow louder, but she had already come too far to back down. This fight wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in justice. And with that, she steeled herself for the battles that lay ahead, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. Judge Warren's resolve was unwavering, but the mounting pressure was beginning to take its toll. The backlash from the police union and the threats she had received were reminders of the fierce resistance she faced. Yet, she was determined to push forward, knowing that real change was within reach. Her next major hurdle was gaining legislative support for the police reform bill. Senator Collins had arranged a series of meetings with key lawmakers to build a coalition of support. Judge Warren joined him, bracing herself for intense discussions and tough negotiations. In the first meeting, she sat across from Senator Harris, a prominent figure on the Judiciary Committee known for his tough stance on law enforcement issues. The senator was skeptical but open-minded. "Judge Warren, your case has captured national attention, but we need more than a compelling story. Why should we believe that your proposed reforms will lead to real change?" Judge Warren took a deep breath and laid out the facts. "Senator Harris, this is not just about one incident or one officer. It's about addressing systemic issues that have persisted for too long. We have evidence of widespread misconduct, and this bill aims to tackle those issues head-on. It includes measures for greater transparency, accountability, and independent oversight, essential elements for restoring public trust." Senator Harris listened intently, but his skepticism remained. "I appreciate your passion, Judge, but we've seen reform proposals before that never gained traction. What makes this different?" Before she could answer, another voice interrupted. It was Representative Lee, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, who had been following the debate closely. "What Judge Warren is proposing is not just a reaction to one incident. It's a proactive approach to preventing future injustices. We need to seize this moment and act on it." With Representative Lee's support, the discussion took a positive turn. The meeting concluded with a commitment to further review the bill and consider amendments that could address some concerns while retaining its core objectives. However, not all meetings went smoothly. During another session, Judge Warren faced strong opposition from a group of lawmakers who were firmly aligned with the police unions. They argued that the bill would undermine law enforcement and endanger officers in the field. The debate grew heated, and at times, it felt like progress was slipping away. Amidst these challenges, Judge Warren's determination was put to the test. She continued to fight for the bill, attending meetings, speaking at rallies, and engaging with the media to maintain public support. The pressure was relentless, and she began to feel the weight of the opposition's attacks, both in her professional and personal life. One evening, as she returned to her apartment, she found a threatening letter slipped under her door. It was filled with vitriol and warnings, making it clear that some would stop at nothing to derail her efforts. Her hands trembled as she read the letter, but she refused to be cowed. Instead, she took it as a sign that she was hitting a nerve, an indication that the fight was making a difference. Despite the mounting threats, the support from civil rights groups and the public remained strong. A major advocacy organization, the Justice Coalition, reached out with an offer to provide additional security and assistance in managing the campaign. Their support bolstered her resolve and reminded her that she was not alone in this struggle. As the legislative debates continued, Judge Warren was invited to speak at a high-profile conference on police reform. The event would bring together activists, policymakers, and community leaders from across the country. It was a chance to galvanize support and highlight the need for change on a national stage. On the day of the conference, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Judge Warren prepared her speech carefully, knowing that this was a critical opportunity to reinforce her message and rally more support. She spoke passionately about her experiences, the need for systemic reform, and the broader implications for justice and equality. The speech was met with a standing ovation, and the media coverage that followed was overwhelmingly positive. The momentum from the conference helped shift the narrative, drawing more attention to the issues and increasing pressure on lawmakers to act. But just as things seemed to be turning in her favor, Judge Warren received another unsettling call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but colder than before. "You've stirred up a lot of trouble, Judge. Be prepared for what's coming next." The threats were escalating, and the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. But Judge Warren knew she couldn't back down. The fight for justice was far from over, and she was more committed than ever to seeing it through to the end. With renewed determination, she prepared for the next phase of her battle, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The pressure from all sides was mounting, but Judge Warren's resolve remained steadfast. As the legislative battle over the police reform bill continued, she knew that every move she made had to be strategic and impactful. The threats had intensified, and the opposition was becoming more aggressive, but her focus was on getting the bill passed and making meaningful change. Judge Warren's days were packed with meetings, strategy sessions, and public appearances. Her team worked tirelessly, organizing rallies and coordinating with advocacy groups to keep the momentum alive. Senator Collins remained a crucial ally, using his influence to sway undecided lawmakers and rally support for the bill. Together, they were pushing hard to ensure the bill reached the floor for a vote. One of the pivotal moments in the campaign came when a whistleblower from within the police department came forward with crucial evidence. The individual, a former internal affairs investigator named Clara, had uncovered additional documentation showing how the department had systematically covered up misconduct and protected officers like Gray. This evidence could potentially be the smoking gun needed to convince wavering lawmakers of the bill's necessity. Clara agreed to testify before Congress, and the day of her testimony arrived with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The hearing was packed with reporters, lawmakers, and activists, all eager to hear what she had to say. Judge Warren and Senator Collins sat in the audience, their hearts pounding as Clara took the stand. Clara's testimony was compelling and deeply troubling. She detailed the ways in which the department had ignored complaints, manipulated records, and protected officers from accountability. Her revelations added a new layer of urgency to the reform efforts, making it clear that the problems were systemic and far-reaching. But as the hearing concluded, the response from some lawmakers was surprising. While many were moved by Clara's testimony, others began to cast doubt on her credibility and the legitimacy of her claims. The police union launched a full-scale attack on her character, attempting to discredit her and undermine the impact of her testimony. Judge Warren felt the weight of the opposition bearing down on her. The attacks were personal and relentless, aimed at discrediting not only Clara, but also the entire reform movement. It became clear that the opposition was using every tool at their disposal to derail the progress they had made. The situation grew more tense as the vote on the bill approached. Judge Warren's team worked around the clock, calling lawmakers, rallying public support, and addressing concerns raised by opponents. Every moment was crucial, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. In the midst of this whirlwind, Judge Warren received an unexpected visit from Officer Gray. He showed up at her office unannounced, a grim expression on his face. "I wanted to speak to you before this gets any worse," he said. Judge Warren was taken aback. "Why are you here?" Gray took a deep breath. "I know things have been rough, and I know my actions have put you in a difficult position, but I need you to understand, this isn't just about me. It's about the whole system that's broken. And if this bill passes, it's going to change everything." The conversation was tense and fraught with undercurrents, but it was clear that Gray was struggling with the implications of the reform efforts. His visit left Judge Warren with more questions than answers, but it also highlighted the internal conflict within the police force regarding the proposed changes. As the vote drew near, Judge Warren's anxiety mounted. She knew that the outcome would hinge on a few key votes and the ability to maintain the public's support. The final push involved a high-profile press conference where Judge Warren and Senator Collins would lay out their case one last time before the vote. The press conference was a critical moment. Judge Warren addressed the media, passionately defending the bill and urging lawmakers to stand with her. Her speech was powerful and emotional, emphasizing the need for reform and the impact it would have on communities across the country. The day of the vote arrived, and the atmosphere in the Capitol was electric with anticipation. Judge Warren and her team waited anxiously as the roll call began. Each vote was a potential turning point, and the tension in the room was palpable. As the results started coming in, it became clear that the bill had garnered significant support. But just as it seemed victory was within reach, a late-breaking development threw everything into question. A last-minute amendment was proposed by opponents, threatening to undermine key provisions of the bill. Judge Warren and her team scrambled to respond, knowing that their hard-fought progress was at risk. The final hours before the vote were filled with high-stakes negotiations and intense lobbying. The outcome remained uncertain until the very last moment. With the clock ticking and the stakes higher than ever, Judge Warren prepared for what would be the defining moment of her fight for justice. The tension in the Capitol was palpable as Judge Warren and her team waited for the final results of the vote on the police reform bill. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and every second seemed to stretch into eternity. After weeks of intense campaigning, threats, and personal attacks, the moment of truth had arrived. As the final votes were cast, Judge Warren sat in the gallery, her heart racing. The bill had already faced numerous challenges, including a last-minute amendment that threatened to weaken its core provisions. The negotiations had been fierce, and the outcome was still uncertain. The final results would determine whether all their efforts had been in vain or if they had succeeded in pushing through meaningful reform. The vote was announced, and the results were read aloud. The bill had passed, but not without compromises. Some of the more ambitious provisions had been stripped away, and there was still work to be done to ensure that the remaining elements of the bill would be effectively implemented. The victory was bittersweet, a testament to the tireless efforts of Judge Warren, Senator Collins, and countless advocates. But it was clear that the fight for justice was far from over. The press conference following the vote was a whirlwind of emotions. Judge Warren spoke to the media, acknowledging the hard-fought victory, while also highlighting the need for continued vigilance and advocacy. "Today's vote is a step in the right direction," she said, "but it's only the beginning. We must remain committed to pushing for further reforms and ensuring that the changes we've made are effectively implemented." The mixed results of the vote sparked a flurry of reactions from both supporters and critics. Supporters celebrated the passage of the bill as a significant achievement, while critics argued that the compromises had weakened its effectiveness. The debate continued, and the media coverage was extensive, reflecting the high stakes and ongoing challenges of the reform effort. In the days following the vote, Judge Warren faced a new set of challenges. The bill's passage was just the beginning of a long and complex process of implementation. Ensuring that the new policies were put into practice effectively would require continued oversight, advocacy, and engagement with stakeholders. Judge Warren's team worked tirelessly to establish a framework for monitoring and evaluating the implementation of the reforms. They organized meetings with law enforcement agencies, community leaders, and policymakers to ensure that the changes were being carried out as intended. The goal was to build trust and collaboration, addressing any issues or concerns that arose along the way. Despite the progress made, Judge Warren was still grappling with the personal fallout from the campaign. The threats and attacks had taken a toll on her, and she was constantly aware of the risks associated with her high-profile role. She remained vigilant, taking measures to ensure her safety and that of her family. One evening, as she reviewed documents in her office, she received another unexpected call. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. "We need to talk," the caller said. "There's more to the story than you know." The call left Judge Warren with a sense of unease. It was clear that there were still unresolved issues and potential threats that could impact the future of the reform efforts. She knew that the fight for justice was far from over, and that there would be ongoing challenges to confront. As she prepared for the next phase of her advocacy, Judge Warren was determined to remain focused and resilient. The passage of the bill was a significant achievement, but it was only the first step in a much larger journey. She knew that the work ahead would require continued dedication, collaboration, and courage. Judge Warren's story was far from finished. The battles she had fought and the victories she had achieved were just the beginning of a larger movement for justice and reform. As she looked toward the future, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the fight for a fair and just system was worth every effort.